Hey guys, tonight we begin with the twisted theatrics of the Roman Colosseum, a place where fairness was optional, lions were hungry, and subtlety was thrown into the arena alongside prisoners. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The Roman Colosseum was not designed for sportsmanship, it was designed for spectacle, and also possibly as a way for emperors to avoid doing actual paperwork. Today, we have stadiums for soccer. The Romans had stadiums for chaos. If you walked into the Colosseum expecting fairness, you'd be about as disappointed as someone who brought a picnic to a thunderstorm. The crowd wasn't looking for balance. They weren't here to see who fought best. They were here to see who fell best, ideally in the most theatrical way possible. Bonus points for flailing arms and tragic facial expressions. Let's be honest, the Roman definition of entertainment was robust. A perfectly matched fight between two trained gladiators? Sure, that happened. But far more common were the opening acts. Criminals, captives, or very unlucky people who happened to owe the wrong senator money. These folks were given the equivalent of a sharp spoon and told to make it dramatic. And dramatic they made it. The Colosseum wasn't just a stadium, it was a form of civic therapy. Life in ancient Rome could be stressful, plagues, grain shortages, and the occasional fire. Watching someone else have a really, really bad day in a controlled environment was how people coped. And it was free. Funded by the emperor, the games were a very public please-like-me gesture. You got grain, a seat, and a view of someone running from an angry elephant. What more could you want? Even the architecture encouraged inequality. The emperor had the best seat, senators got cushions, and everyone else got a stone bench and sunstroke. The actual people in the arena? They got an audience. So fairness? Not exactly the design priority. This wasn't a fencing match. This was ancient Rome's version of dinner theatre. If your dinner included fried dormice and the play ended in screaming. If you were a participant, you weren't measured by your win-loss ratio. You were measured by how loud the crowd got when you tripped over your own foot and fell directly into a net. Nothing says public service quite like forcing an untrained civilian to fight a heavily armed professional in front of 50,000 strangers. The Romans had a word for this: entertainment. And while we have game shows and cooking competitions, they preferred something with slightly more risk and significantly fewer rules. Enter the gladiator versus amateur match, a charming tradition where a trained killer faced off against, say, a baker with a sword, or a bureaucrat with an existential crisis. These weren't just one-off mistakes. These were planned. Sometimes the amateurs were volunteers, sometimes they were condemned criminals, and sometimes they were just guys who really should have read the fine print. Gladiators, contrary to modern movie logic, weren't all enslaved nobodies. Some were volunteers, some were celebrities, and all of them were highly trained. They lived in schools, had coaches, and were basically professional athletes, except with more armor and fewer endorsement deals. Now imagine pitting one of them against someone who learned sword fighting from watching shadows on a wall. The result was predictable, and that was the point. This wasn't about suspense. This was about spectacle. The audience didn't want a fair fight. They wanted to cheer for the obvious winner, while pretending the other guy had a shot. It was the ancient Roman version of watching a squirrel try to drive a chariot. And for the amateur, well, they had options. Option 1. Survive long enough to be mildly impressive. Option 2. Survive long enough for the crowd to feel sorry for you. Option 3. Get hit so quickly and dramatically that the audience laughs and the emperor nods in approval. If you were particularly charming or dramatic, you might even earn a reprieve. Romans loved a good underdog story, especially if the underdog was bleeding just the right amount. but most of the time, the outcome was settled before the match began. The crowd knew it. The fighters knew it. Even the guy sweeping the sand probably knew it. Let's say you're accused of a crime in ancient Rome. Maybe you stole something. Maybe you looked at the emperor's statue a little too long. Maybe your neighbor just really doesn't like you. Congratulations, you now qualify for a special appearance in the Colosseum. And by special appearance, we mean you're going to be introduced to a lion, up close, personally, and probably without warning. The damnatio ad bestias, or condemnation to the beasts, was a Roman tradition that asked the important question: what if our justice system was also a zoo? It was Rome's solution to everything from theft to treason. Throw the accused into the arena, open a gate, cue the music and the panic. The lions weren't ordinary cats either. They were imported, often from North Africa, and treated like star performers. They got better transportation than most citizens, and sometimes better food. The prisoner, meanwhile, got a tunic and a vague sense of doom. No armor, no weapon, occasionally a stick. Because nothing says fairness like handing someone a twig and telling them to make it look exciting. This wasn't a fight, it was a message. The Empire didn't just punish you, it made you part of the show. The more dramatic your final moments, the more the crowd cheered, the more the Emperor smiled, and the more everyone forgot their rent was overdue. And yes, people brought their children. Because why go to the Forum when you could teach your kids valuable life lessons like, don't commit fraud or you'll be lunch? Sometimes the condemned surprised everyone. They ran, they dodged, they climbed things. There's at least one account of a man playing dead so convincingly that the lion lost interest. Unfortunately, the crowd didn't. They made sure the show went on. If you're thinking, this seems excessive, the Romans would have agreed, but only if you suggested not using lions. That would have ruined the aesthetic. So let's say the lion match is over, and the crowds had their fill of seeing unarmed prisoners make friends with fate. What's next? Naturally, let's arm some people and send them back in, but with more animals, and weirder ones. Enter the narrations, Rome's version of man versus wild, if the wild was extremely annoyed, and the man was wearing gladiator sandals. These were staged hunts, where specially trained fighters, or, let's be honest, whoever was available and didn't owe too many favours, were given weapons and told, try not to look nervous. The Colosseum would be transformed into a faux wilderness. Fake trees, imported sand, maybe even a bit of shrubbery if someone had the budget. Then wild animals were released. Leopards, bears, ostriches, rhinos, crocodiles, basically anything that could stomp, charge, or deeply confuse an audience. Fighters were expected to battle them with spears, nets, or in some cases, absolutely nothing helpful. There are stories of men sent in with slings or sticks, which is exactly as effective as yelling please stop at a charging boar. And here's the twist, it still wasn't a fair fight, just in the opposite direction. Sometimes the animals were sick, drugged, or starved to make things manageable. Other times they were just dumped into chaos, unsure if they were supposed to attack or audition for a tragedy. Not that it mattered. The goal wasn't survival. It was spectacle. Did the crowd care about the animals? Not especially. If a rhino managed to flip a man into the air like a decorative coin, they cheered. If the man somehow won, they cheered louder. There was no losing, just entertainment. And occasionally, the animals teamed up. In one account, a bear and a lion supposedly ignored the humans and started fighting each other. The crowd adored it. The organizer probably got promoted. It wasn't hunting. It wasn't combat. It was what happens when an empire gets rich enough to invent new hobbies and bored enough to turn the food chain into improv theatre. By now, the Roman Colosseum had established a theme. Take something brutal and somehow make it weirder. But when they wanted to really impress the audience, they dipped into mythology. Because why simply execute someone when you could recreate a legend while doing it? This delightful tradition was known as fatal charades. Not a game, unfortunately. but a form of public execution that merged storytelling with creative sentencing. Picture a condemned man dressed as Icarus, strapped into fake wings, and pushed off a platform. No, he didn't fly. No, it wasn't subtle. The Romans loved mythology, gods, heroes, tragic endings. So instead of quietly dealing with criminals, they reimagined their deaths as performances. The audience wasn't just watching justice, they were watching art. Violent, state-funded art. Take the story of Prometheus, for instance. In myth, he's chained to a rock and has a certain recurring eagle problem. In the Colosseum, they skipped the rock and used stage props. But the eagle? That part was real. Or Orpheus, the tragic musician who tried to rescue his wife from the underworld. The Roman version? A man in a tunic with a harp walks across the arena, and then someone quietly releases a few large, extremely uninterested animals. It didn't end with music. The crowd, of course, loved it. Finally, culture and entertainment, all in one. You could feel refined for recognizing the myth and still point and laugh when the guy in the Apollo wig tripped over his sandals. Were these performances accurate to the original stories? Not remotely. But accuracy wasn't the goal. Spectacle was. If they remembered the plot correctly, great. If not, they just invented a new version where Hercules loses a foot. To be clear, these weren't plays. The performers weren't actors. They were people who'd been sentenced to death and were now expected to help bring a story to life before exiting it in the final act. No curtain call, no applause, just a well-timed nod from the emperor, and a satisfied crowd who now felt a little more cultured, despite the fact that someone had just been Zeused off a scaffold. Just when you think the Colosseum couldn't get more extra, Rome said, "What if we made it a lake?" Yes, at various points in its early history, the Colosseum hosted mock naval battles called naumachii. Because when you've already turned executions into theatre, the next logical step is to simulate a maritime war, in a building that is very much not near the sea. Roman engineers, who clearly had both talent and too much time, figured out how to flood the arena floor, not with symbolism, with actual water, the kind that makes boats float and inexperienced sailors panic. The plan was simple: fill the floor, toss in a few ships, and stage a battle with real people who were often less informed about rowing than the audience. Sometimes these mock battles reenacted famous sea clashes. Other times, it was just teams of captives told, row, fight, and try not to look like you've never seen an oar before. And let's talk about those boats. They were smaller than real warships, of course. You try fitting a full fleet into an amphitheatre and see how far you get. But they were still decked out with paint, flags, and very real weapons, which meant there was a good chance that someone was going to fall in, or be pushed in, or just jump in because it seemed like the better option. The audience watched from above like cruise passengers watching a buffet fire, equal parts confused and delighted. Nobody really cared about naval tactics. They wanted to see if someone fell off the boat in a dramatic way. Bonus points if they screamed something poetic while doing it. And yes, there were moments of drama. Ships colliding, fighters leaping across decks, people accidentally poking their allies with spears. Honestly, it was less naval strategy and more floaty chaos with costumes. Eventually, the Colosseum stopped flooding itself for these shows. Probably because it turns out water and ancient concrete don't make the best long-term couple. But for a while, Romans got their sea battles, their splashing, and their laughs, even if half the participants couldn't swim and the other half couldn't steer. Sometimes even staged combat wasn't dramatic enough. That's when the organisers rolled out the party pack: blindfolds, shackles, mismatched weapons, and a general disregard for the laws of physics or common decency. Why? Because fairness is boring. But watching someone try to fight blindfolded, hilarious, for everyone except the person wearing the blindfold. One popular twist was to take a perfectly competent fighter and make their life significantly harder for entertainment's sake. Remove their armour, shorten their weapon, or give them something completely useless, like a net, or worse, a wooden sword. Nothing says good luck, quite like stepping into the arena holding what is essentially a stick from a child's toy set. Then there were the shackles. Fighters were sometimes chained by the ankles, wrists, or both. Because clearly, if you've already trained to survive an armed duel in front of thousands, what you really need is to be physically restrained while doing it. Bonus: it makes dodging a lot more interpretive. Some were forced to fight while tied together. Yes, to each other. It was called the three-legged race of doom. Okay, not officially, but it should have been. Imagine trying to survive with someone else's panic dictating your footwork. One stumbles, both fall, and the crowd loses its mind. Of course, these gimmicks weren't used on just anyone. Gladiators were investments. The ones who drew crowds and had reputations were spared the most ridiculous setups, unless the audience was bored and the emperor wanted a laugh. Then all bets were off, and let's not forget the occasional surprise opponent. You think you're fighting one guy, and suddenly a trapdoor opens and out comes a second one, or even better, something with claws. Imagine a WWE match where the floor randomly spits out a bear. Ancient Rome did that, but sincerely. None of this was in the rulebook, mostly because there was no rulebook, just a checklist. Is it entertaining? Is it absurd? Can it be cleaned up before the next match? You might assume that the Roman Colosseum, in all its chaotic brilliance, gave its audience a break between events. A moment to stretch, grab some olives, maybe talk about how well the gladiators were accessorized. And technically, yes, there was an intermission, but in true Roman fashion, even that was turned into a performance. Welcome to the Meridiani, the midday break. While the morning had beast hunts and the afternoon promised gladiator duels, lunchtime was reserved for something a little more procedural, public executions, because nothing pairs with your midday bread roll quite like the empire's idea of due process. These executions weren't spontaneous. They were scheduled, organized, timed with the precision of a stage play. The condemned, usually criminals, deserters, or people who had annoyed the wrong bureaucrat, were brought out for the crowd to see justice being served, loudly and without any red tape. No one was expecting drama. This wasn't a fight. It was a warning. Don't be like this guy, the Empire said. Also, please enjoy your olives. And the methods, well, let's just say they were creative. Sometimes it was quick, a clean finish and on with the show. Other times, it was needlessly elaborate, especially if the person had made headlines. The Romans believed justice should be efficient, theatrical, and ideally sponsored by someone in a toga. The crowd by this point was used to it. Kids asked for better seats. Merchants hawked snacks. No one blinked. If anything, they got annoyed when it ran long. "Come on," someone would mutter. "We're just here for the real matches." That's what makes this part so absurd. For the audience, executions were just filler content, like commercials. Only instead of advertising soap, they demonstrated why you shouldn't steal one. And if that feels unsettling, that's kind of the point. The Colosseum wasn't just an arena, it was a carefully choreographed showcase of control. Every moment, including intermission, was designed to remind the public who had power, and what happened when you challenged it. In modern sports, referees make the calls. In the Roman Colosseum, the final verdict came from thousands of sweaty spectators who had eaten too much bread and were possibly 2 goblets deep into wine. Yes, in Rome, justice was crowdsourced. After a gladiator match, the loser didn't always die immediately. If he fought well, or at least flailed with enthusiasm, the final decision rested with the audience. Would he live to fight another day, or become a cautionary tale for future footwork? Enter the thumbs. You've probably heard of the famous thumbs down, meaning death. Except, plot twist, historians aren't entirely sure which thumb meant what. Some sources say thumbs up meant execution, like a sword being drawn. Others say thumbs down meant sheathing the blade, aka mercy. And others argue the gestures weren't even about thumbs at all. but more vague hand-waving that made gladiators wish Romans had just invented scorecards. Either way, the audience's reaction mattered, and they were not shy. They came to the Colosseum ready to cheer, boo, and yell unsolicited opinions at people literally fighting for their lives. It was ancient Yelp, only with more tunics and fewer stars. If a fighter was boring, he might get silence, the worst possible outcome. If he was exciting, the crowd roared for mercy, or punishment, or both. It was a little unclear, honestly, but very loud. Some gladiators courted favour. They played to the stands. They had fans. Yes, actual fan bases. Certain fighters were known by name, and some even had merchandise. Okay, not official merchandise, but people wore carvings of them. Same idea. And if the emperor was present? Oh, it got political fast. He could override the crowd's vote, granting mercy or insisting on execution. Either way, he was reading the room, like a stand-up comic, but with higher stakes and fewer jokes. Well, depending on the emperor. So while the games looked like chaos, they were weirdly democratic, at least for the fighters. If you entertained, you had a shot. If you didn't, well, the crowd was ready to vote, with their voices, their hands, and occasionally their sandwiches. Because in the Colosseum, survival wasn't just about skill. It was about giving the people a good show, and hoping they were in a generous mood. Of all the creatures you might expect to face in the Roman Colosseum, lions, tigers, that one guy with a net, the humble wild boar probably wouldn't top your list. But in ancient Rome, pigs weren't just food. They were part of the entertainment, and not in a cute, farm petting zoo kind of way. Wild boars were no joke. These were muscular, tusk-wielding, forest-born battering rams with hooves. Think of them as nature's angry bowling balls, with less mercy and more momentum. Now imagine one of them charging at you, in front of a cheering crowd, while you try to look heroic in a leather skirt. Gladiators were trained for many things, but pig strategy was not high on the curriculum. Sometimes boars were used in animal hunts, venations, released into the arena for fighters to take down with spears. Other times, in an effort to keep things spicy, the boars were introduced mid-combat as surprise guests. Nothing livened up a duel like a 300-pound pig sprinting across the stage uninvited. In at least one event, records describe an animal so aggressive that it charged through props, ignored its handler, and nearly ran into the front row. The Romans loved it. Nothing says great public funding like airborne pork. And if you're wondering how this counts as entertainment, to the Roman crowd, unpredictability was the point. A lion was majestic. A tiger was terrifying. But a boar, that was hilarious. Especially when someone underestimated it. Even emperors got in on the action. Some hosted themed hunts, showcasing their exotic animal collections, including particularly fierce pigs, just to prove how well-stocked their empire was in both bacon and bravado. The fighters, meanwhile, were mostly just trying to survive. You could train to counter a sword. You could anticipate a human. But a wild boar, that was pure chaos in pig form, with tusks that turned kneecaps into hazards. And in the grand tradition of Roman entertainment, no one asked the important question, should we be doing this? They just asked, can we fit another boar into this scene? Spoiler, they could. And they often did. The arena floor was no ordinary stretch of sand. Beneath it lay a labyrinth of tunnels, cages, lifts, and pulleys, all carefully designed to ruin someone's afternoon. These mechanical marvels allowed stagehands to raise animals, props, or sometimes entire set pieces into the arena with unsettling theatrical timing. You're a gladiator, mid-fight, sweating under the Roman sun, and just as you're about to win, boom, the floor opens and out comes a leopard. Not part of the match, just bonus content. This was not accidental. Roman event planners, yes, that was essentially a real job, loved surprises. Why have a normal duel when you could turn it into an obstacle course with hidden lions? And it wasn't just animals. Sometimes chariots would roll out, sometimes fire pits. sometimes large wooden constructs meant to represent mythological backdrops, like the underworld or a poorly made volcano. All of it designed to keep the crowd engaged and the participants deeply confused. It turned combat into theatre, and theatre into absolute chaos. You didn't just fight your opponent. You fought the floor, the props, and your growing suspicion that someone behind the scenes was laughing very hard. These trapdoors were operated by teams of slaves and workers beneath the stage, coordinating timing with the precision of a military operation, or at least a mildly chaotic circus. One wrong lever, and suddenly a bear appeared in the wrong scene, or worse, didn't appear at all, leaving two fighters awkwardly circling each other for 20 minutes. To the audience, it was thrilling. To the combatants, it was a lesson in humility and ankle awareness. Because in the Colosseum, you weren't just facing opponents. You were facing architecture, stage design, and the Roman Empire's deep commitment to surprising people with unpleasant things. If the gods truly favoured the brave, then surely they also appreciated the ones who managed not to fall through a trapdoor mid-victory pose. At first glance, gladiator versus gladiator matches sound like the fairest part of the Colosseum schedule. Two trained professionals, well-matched, facing off in front of a roaring crowd, like ancient UFC but with better outfits. But of course, this is Rome. And fairness, as always, was optional. While some bouts were evenly matched, for dramatic tension and crowd investment, many others were rigged faster than a politician's re-election campaign. One fighter might be a seasoned veteran with years of arena experience. The other, a terrified rookie who'd just figured out which end of the sword was the business end, and don't get too attached to the idea of standard weapons either. Sometimes one fighter got a gladius and a shield, the other got a net and a trident, not because it made tactical sense, but because the crowd liked variety and someone in event planning had a flair for chaos. These odd pairings had names. The Secutor versus the Retiarius, trident guy, was especially popular. One had armour, a big helmet, and traditional gear. The other wore almost nothing, carried a glorified fish fork, and relied on dodging for dear life. It was less battle of equals, and more, can Speedy McBareFeet avoid being flattened? Why the mismatches? Because Rome loved contrast. The sight of two identically armed fighters was boring. But throw a bulky armoured tank against a wiry, nearly naked rope flinger. Now that's entertainment. And if one gladiator had a growing fan base or a sponsor to impress, the match might be tilted in his favour. Not so he could prove himself, but so he could look even cooler while winning. Gladiators weren't just fighters. They were investments, walking brand names. If someone had a dramatic win streak or a distinctive fighting style, the Empire leaned in. Fans bought figurines, children reenacted their victories. Merchandising wasn't official, but it existed. So yes, sometimes they were handed an easy victory just to keep the legend alive. The losing fighter, well, he was either forgettable or unlucky. Possibly both. Because in the Colosseum, balance was an illusion. The audience didn't come for sportsmanship. They came to see someone outmatched, and hopefully outmaneuvered. And if that person somehow won anyway, now that was a story. If you thought the Roman Colosseum was just about swords and sand, think again. It was also about spin, and not the kind that happens when someone gets hit too hard and falls in a dramatic spiral. No, this was politics. The Colosseum wasn't just a place to entertain the masses. It was a PR machine, custom built to remind everyone exactly who was in charge. Every event, every match, every oops we released two tigers moment was part of a carefully curated imperial message. Obey, or else. Executions weren't just punishments. They were statements. Traitors, rebels, or just people who annoyed powerful senators were dispatched publicly and theatrically, often with backstory and staging. One day, you're in a scroll with a bad opinion. The next day, you're playing Fallen Hero number 2 in a reenactment of a myth you didn't ask to be part of. And the Emperor? He wasn't just watching, he was starring. He sat in the best seat, naturally, dead center, plenty of shade, and just close enough to the action to nod thoughtfully when someone was decapitated artistically. The crowd watched him as much as the fights. His reactions mattered. If he gave a thumbs up, it wasn't just a gesture. It was a headline. Some emperors used the games to build favor. Bread and circuses, remember? Keep the people fed and distracted, and they won't notice the empire's budget falling apart. Others used it to intimidate. A public execution here, a surprise lion there, all very motivating. And if you were lucky enough to be a popular gladiator, you could even be used politically. Fight well, and you were proof of Rome's strength. Refuse to die properly? Suddenly you were a liability. Sometimes entire events were staged around political narratives. Celebrating a military victory? Great. Let's reenact it in the arena with extras and actual casualties. Hosting a foreign dignitary? Let's show them a good time with tigers. Nothing impresses a visiting official like a guy in armor jumping over a hippo. So yes, the Colosseum was Rome's most violent press conference. Every splash of sand and dramatic collapse was part of the empire's broader messaging strategy. Rome is strong, Rome is glorious, and Rome is definitely watching. With all the mismatches, trapdoors, weaponized pigs, and political overtones, why did the Colosseum stay open for so long? Simple. Rome was addicted to spectacle. These weren't just shows. They were cultural events, political tools, social glue, and occasionally, legally questionable therapy for a civilization that desperately needed hobbies. The empire was big, complicated, and frequently on fire, sometimes literally. But give the people a gladiator match, and suddenly everything felt stable. The formula worked. A bored, overtaxed citizen might complain about grain shortages, but toss them a seat in the Colosseum, a snack, and a front-row view of someone wrestling a panther in a wig. Suddenly, life wasn't so bad. That's Empire Building 101. Distract, dazzle, repeat. And emperors loved it. The games gave them instant approval ratings. Want to win the crowd after raising taxes? Host a week-long festival? Accidentally insulted the Senate? Release some flaming chariots and tigers? Want to make a general feel insecure? Have his enemy play the hero in a restaged myth and forget to tell him it's a metaphor? The Colosseum was the original social media feed. Constant updates. Constant drama. A place where careers were made, enemies were erased, and your public image could be defined by a single thumb gesture. No comments section, though. Just roaring applause or complete silence, which in Rome was basically a downvote. But even the greatest empires get tired. Over time, the shows became less extravagant. The animals harder to import. The audience less dazzled. By the time Rome began to crumble, even the Colosseum started to feel like yesterday's news. Sand and stone don't last forever, and neither do attention spans. Still, the legacy lingered. Even today, we remember the Colosseum not as a sports arena, but as a monument to how far a society will go for a good show. It wasn't fair, it wasn't kind, but it was unforgettable. Because when you build a stage for 50,000 people and fill it with fire, iron, and politics, well, you're not aiming for subtlety, you're aiming for history. Imagine you're a farmer in ancient Ireland. It's April 30th, and the winds are shifting. You look out over the rolling hills and mutter to yourself, "Yep, time to light something on fire again." Welcome to Beltane, the ancient Celtic fire festival that wasn't just about celebrating the start of summer, it was about surviving it. While modern folks might pop a sunscreen bottle and complain about the heat, your ancestors were busy stacking wood and herding cows between two roaring bonfires. Why? Because they believed the smoke could purify, protect, and maybe even impress the local spirits. In this world, fire wasn't just a handy tool, it was a living force, a mediator between realms. Lighting it wasn't casual, it was sacred. The druids, the spiritual MVPs of the community, were in charge of the flames. They'd chant, gesture dramatically, and eventually summon a central bonfire, known as the need fire, which every household flame in the region was relit from. Think of it as a spiritual reset button, but with way more sparks and fewer user manuals. As the fires crackled, villagers would lead their livestock, yes, the actual cows and sheep, between the twin blazes. It sounds a bit excessive, but this was insurance against disease and misfortune. Want your cattle to stay healthy and productive? March them through fire. Want to stay fertile? Take a daring leap over the flames yourself. Nothing says romance like mild singeing. And of course, there was dancing, naked or clothed, depending on the year and how much mead was involved. Couples might jump the flames together to bind their love, while solo dancers hoped to stir some divine matchmaking from above. Beltane was more than a festival. It was a ritual of seasonal transformation, a fiery handshake between mortals and the other world. And once the fires died down, the embers were scattered in the fields, spreading the blessing of flame across the land. Now let's leave the damp hills of Celtic lands and cross into the arid, sun-blasted heart of ancient Persia. Here, fire wasn't something to dance around while hoping your sheep stayed healthy. It was a godly presence, a divine force that had to be fed, revered, and absolutely not sneezed on. Welcome to Zoroastrianism, one of the world's oldest monotheistic religions, where fire wasn't just sacred, it was truth itself. In fact, they called it Atar, a living symbol of Asher, the divine order of the universe. That meant fire wasn't just a helpful kitchen guest, it was a glowing representative of cosmic balance. So, no pressure. The centerpiece of worship was the fire temple, where priests known as mobeds tended to eternal flames that had been burning for years, sometimes centuries. Think of them as divine janitors with robes, armed not with extinguishers, but bundles of sandalwood and eagle feathers for gentle fanning. The idea was that this flame had to be kept alive, unbroken, unpolluted, undisturbed. Letting it go out? That was basically a cosmic offense, a divine oopsie on a legendary scale. These fire rituals weren't limited to static worship either. During major festivals like Sadeh and Chahoshanbe Suri, whole communities would light bonfires in public squares to celebrate creation, rebirth, and the ever-ongoing battle between light and darkness. People would leap over the fires while chanting things like, "Give me your red colour, take away my sickly pallor," which, let's be honest, is basically the ancient Persian version of New Year, New Me. Sparks weren't just metaphorical in these moments. The fire became a messenger, carrying prayers to the heavens, while also warding off lurking demons and any bad luck that might have been hiding under your rug. Even funeral rites avoided flame directly touching the dead. Why? Because that would pollute it. Fire needed to stay clean, pure, and judgment-free, like an eternal therapist who's seen it all but never says a word. In the Persian view of things, fire wasn't something to be tamed. It was a sacred thread connecting humanity to the divine blueprint of the cosmos. A warm, flickering flame, yes, but also a blazing reminder to keep your soul and your kindling in good order. Now we jog, literally, into ancient Greece, where fire festivals weren't just holy ceremonies, they were full-on athletic competitions. Because when the Greeks honoured the gods, they didn't just pray, they sprinted, with fire. The torch race, or Lampedodromia, was the signature event. Imagine a sacred relay where runners passed lit torches like flaming batons across Athens, and the goal wasn't just speed, it was to keep the flame alive. If you dropped your torch or let it go out, disqualified. Congratulations, you've failed both your city and the divine. These races were held in honour of gods associated with fire and knowledge: Hephaestus, the forge god, and Prometheus, the rebellious titan who famously stole fire from Olympus and gave it to humanity. A bold move that earned him eternal liver-pecking punishment from Zeus, which, in Greek mythology, counts as a light slap on the wrist. The torch race wasn't just sport, it was ritual theatre. By keeping the flame burning, runners symbolised the endurance of divine wisdom passed down to mortals. It wasn't enough to possess the fire. You had to prove you could carry it without fumbling like a butterfingered apprentice in Hephaestus's workshop. And this wasn't a casual jog through the olive groves. The races were often held at night, the only light coming from the flaming torches bouncing through the darkness, casting shadows across temples, columns, and confused livestock. The visual impact was intentional. The gods were watching, and you better make it look epic. There were also deeper symbolic layers. Prometheus's gift of fire wasn't just warmth or cooking fuel. It represented intellect, transformation, rebellion. In honoring him with torch races, the Greeks weren't just reenacting a myth. They were subtly reminding themselves of their own clever defiance, their pursuit of civilization, even if it came at a divine cost. Winners received a crown or a small statue, possibly even a jar of olive oil, because this is Greece we're talking about. But the real prize was glory, and maybe a temporary break from angry gods smiting your crops. So the next time you see a modern Olympic torch relay, know that it's not just a sports tradition. It's a flickering echo of Greek reverence for stolen fire, cosmic rebellion, and the timeless art of running really fast while not burning your eyebrows off. From Greek torch relays, we now turn east to ancient India, where fire wasn't stolen from the gods. It was the god. Meet Agni, the Hindu god of fire, who wasn't just a deity of warmth and light, but a cosmic postman. His role? Deliver offerings from earth to the heavens, through fire, with perfect reliability. No lost packages, no customer service line. In Vedic rituals, the sacred ceremonies of ancient India, Agni was the bridge between humans and gods. Any prayer worth its salt needed fire. And not just any fire, it had to be lit properly, fed with clarified butter, ghee, basically the holy nectar of every ritual, and accompanied by mantras. These were called yajnas, and they were so important that priests devoted their entire lives to mastering them. Think of it as spiritual pyromania, but with a lot more incense and fewer insurance claims. In a typical yajna, a sacred fire pit called a Havan Kund was constructed, often in intricate geometric patterns aligned with celestial forces. The fire had to be coaxed into life using friction or sacred chants, not a matchstick in sight. And once it was lit, Agni became alive. You weren't just watching a fire, you were making eye contact with a god. But this wasn't a one-time thing. The most devout households kept eternal fires burning, flames that never went out, passed down from generation to generation. If a fire died, it wasn't just inconvenient, it was a spiritual emergency. Some even believed it could disturb cosmic balance. Imagine being the guy who accidentally spilled water on a divine flame. Oops doesn't quite cover it. Fire festivals like Lori and Makar Sankranti later evolved to carry this Vedic legacy into seasonal celebrations, marking agricultural transitions with bonfires, songs, and offerings. It was joy wrapped in smoke, purification dancing in sparks, and unlike some traditions where fire was kept at arm's length, here it was intimate, living, and profoundly respected. Agni wasn't feared like a wildfire. He was honored like an ancestor, a witness to every vow, every birth, every passing soul. If ancient India saw fire as a divine messenger, then ancient Egypt saw it as the very breath of the sun, God himself. Fire here wasn't just a flicker, it was cosmic authority, embodied in Ra, the sun god who rode across the sky in a blazing solar bark. And every night, he fought off a chaos serpent in the underworld, powered entirely by radiant, celestial fire. No pressure, Ra. But let's zoom in on the human rituals, because while Ra handled the solar commute, Egyptians celebrated with flame too. Fire wasn't used for warmth. It was a symbol of purification, protection, and rebirth. Temples were designed to catch the morning sun in their darkest chambers, as if the gods themselves were turning on the lights. The most famous fire ritual? The Feast of Opet, or the Wepet Renpet festival, which marked the new year. It wasn't your average countdown and fireworks situation. It was a multi-day spectacle featuring priests, incense, offerings, and, most importantly, ceremonial torches carried in processions. These weren't just for show. The fire represented Ra's rejuvenating energy returning to Earth, warding off darkness and illness. It was like spiritual pest control, but with sacred pyrotechnics. Even in funerary practices, fire played a crucial but carefully managed role. Egyptians didn't cremate, that was a little too final for them, but they burned incense and sacred oils during burial rites. The smoke rising from the offerings was believed to carry the soul's essence upward, helping it journey safely into the afterlife. And if the scent happened to please the gods? Even better. Priests also maintained eternal flames within temples, particularly those dedicated to Ra or his fiery daughter, Sekhmet. A lion-headed goddess you really didn't want to upset. Her festivals included fire rituals meant to appease her destructive nature. And yes, these sometimes involved beer dyed red to look like blood, because Egyptian gods loved symbolism and mildly theatrical drama. Fire in Egypt wasn't chaotic. It was orderly, celestial, radiant. It came with scrolls, hymns, and complex schedules. Every spark had a script. Now we descend into the jungles and highlands of ancient Mesoamerica, where fire didn't just symbolize life, it was the engine of the cosmos. And keeping that engine running required a bit more than candles and kind thoughts. Among the Aztecs, Maya, and Zapotecs, fire was a sacred force that governed time, agriculture, even human fate. But they didn't mess around with mere festivals. They had calendrical fire resets. Enter the new fire ceremony, held every 52 years, when the Aztec calendar completed its sacred cycle. A kind of cosmic Y2K, only with higher stakes and fewer IT professionals. As the dreaded date approached, all household fires were extinguished across the land. Cities went dark. People destroyed their belongings. They fasted, prayed, and basically assumed the world might end. Then, at midnight, priests ascended a sacred hilltop and performed a heart sacrifice. Only after the heart was burned and the new flame kindled on the chest cavity, yes, really, was the fire declared reborn. From this one divine spark, every household flame across the empire would be rekindled. Fire was rebirth, continuity, and cosmic validation. If the fire failed to light, the sun might not rise again. No pressure. In Maya civilization, fire also played a key role in temple dedications and royal rituals. Newly built temples were awakened with fire. They would literally burn offerings in the central chamber to activate the structure, as if inviting divine tenants to move in. And if you were a king, your accession to power required fire rites, including incense burning and sometimes ritual bloodletting just to show you meant it. The Zapotecs were just as committed. Their fire god, Cochio, was closely tied to storms and lightning, and festivals in his honor included bonfires, dances, and occasionally the dramatic burning of symbolic effigies, sort of a divine piñata with a flammable personality. Across all these cultures, fire was a dialogue with the gods, but also a demand. It was hungry, and it needed feeding, not just with logs or copal resin, but with sacrifice. The smoke didn't just rise, it spoke. Now let's sail into the vast Pacific, where islands dot the ocean like stepping stones of fire. For the ancient Polynesians, fire wasn't just a necessity. It was an origin story, a divine inheritance passed down from gods who lived inside mountains. At the heart of many Polynesian fire beliefs stands the goddess Pele, the tempestuous spirit of volcanoes, particularly revered in Hawaiian mythology. She wasn't a calm hearth goddess gently tending your cooking pot. She was a blazing force of nature who created islands with her lava, then destroyed them in a fit of divine rage. Respecting fire in this culture wasn't optional, it was survival. Pele was said to live in the Halema Uma'u crater at the summit of Kilauea, one of the most active volcanoes in the world. When it erupted, it wasn't a natural disaster, it was Pele expressing herself. Lava flows were seen as her fiery footsteps, reshaping the land according to divine will. People left offerings near craters, flowers, food, chants, sometimes even hair or nails. Because when a goddess is literally remaking geography, it pays to stay on her good side. Fire festivals in Polynesia took many forms, but one of the most mesmerizing was the Siva Afi, or fire knife dance, still performed in places like Samoa and Tonga. Originally part of warrior rituals, the dance involved spinning flaming knives while leaping, flipping, and generally defying common sense. It wasn't just showmanship, it was spiritual display. The fire knife was seen as an extension of inner strength, a dance with ancestral power. In everyday life, Polynesians used fire to cook in umu, earth ovens, light paths during ceremonies, and communicate with the spirit world. Fire was the bridge between visible and invisible, the earthly and the divine. Even funeral rites involved sacred torches and chants, guiding the soul toward ancestral realms across the sea. Some islanders believed that ancestral spirits travelled on flame, visible in the flickering of torches or the glow of fireflies. To ignore or mishandle fire was to risk offending both gods and ghosts. You'd think the frigid lands of ancient Scandinavia would be too cold and soggy for fiery rituals, but the Norse had a relationship with fire that was anything but lukewarm. In a land of icy fjords and eternal winters, fire meant more than comfort. It meant survival, both physical and spiritual. At the heart of Norse mythology is a cosmic duality, fire and ice. The world itself was born from the clash between Muspelheim, the realm of fire, and Niflheim, the land of frost. When the two collided in the primordial void of Ginnungagap, sparks flew, literally, and out of that chaos came the first being, Ymir, and eventually the gods. So fire wasn't just essential, it was a creator and a destroyer. The most feared fire figure in Norse mythology was Surtur, a fire giant from Muspelheim who, according to prophecy, would ride out during Ragnarok, the Norse apocalypse, with a flaming sword in hand. His mission? Burn the world to ash. You can see how fire wasn't taken lightly. On a more earthly level, fire festivals marked seasonal changes, especially the end of winter and the return of the sun. Celebrations like Yule, which later merged with Christmas, were deeply fire-centric. Great logs were burned for days, hello, Yule log, representing the rebirth of the sun. The longer it burned, the better your luck for the coming year. Lighting the Yule fire wasn't just cozy, it was cosmic insurance. Bonfires were also lit during midsummer festivals, where the light was at its peak and spirits roamed more freely. Leaping over flames, a practice shared with other cultures, was believed to grant protection, fertility, and possibly the ability to impress your crush. And when it came to death, fire had the final word. Viking funerals weren't all longboats and slow-motion archery, but yes, cremation was common, and fire was believed to release the soul to Valhalla, or Folkvanger, the afterlife realms of warriors and the chosen. The fire cleansed, elevated, and honoured. It was part farewell, part transformation, and part dramatic flair. Across the ancient world, fire wasn't just life-giving, it was judgmental. It could warm your home or incinerate your legacy. For many cultures, fire became the ultimate test, a tool of divine justice, spiritual purification, and cosmic reckoning. And unlike modern courts, there were no appeals. In ancient India, fire wasn't only a god, it was also a witness. In the epic Ramayana, Sita, wife of the hero Rama, had to undergo a trial by fire, literally. After being kidnapped and rescued, she walked through flames to prove her purity. The fire, Agni himself, emerged not with a guilty verdict, but with a divine nod. She was unscathed, and therefore innocent. A hot mess of gender expectations, yes, but also an example of how fire was seen as the final arbiter of truth. In medieval and ancient Europe, similar ideas took root in trial by ordeal. Suspected criminals, witches, or unfortunates with bad luck were sometimes subjected to fire-based tests, like holding a red-hot iron or walking across glowing coals. If their wounds healed cleanly, they were innocent. If not, well, You probably didn't want to be around for the closing arguments. While these trials weren't exactly spiritually uplifting, they showed the lingering belief that fire could reveal divine will. In Zoroastrianism, one of the earliest notions of fire as judgment emerged in the concept of Chinvat Bridge, the crossing point to the afterlife. At death, souls would walk a blade-thin bridge above a river of molten metal. Those who had lived righteously would find it as gentle as warm milk. The wicked? Let's just say they discovered that divine metal has no chill. Even the Aztecs, who worshipped fire with meticulous devotion, saw it as a cyclical trial. If their new fire ceremony failed, the world could end. Fire, once a gift from the gods, could also become their chosen method of cosmic deletion. It kept humanity humble, and maybe a little flammable. Throughout all these traditions, fire became a mirror. What you brought to it, truth, guilt, devotion, or fear, was what it revealed. Whether in sacred rites or terrifying trials, fire was the final exam of the soul. In ancient Egypt, paying taxes wasn't just an economic duty, it was practically a spiritual obligation. The pharaoh wasn't your average bureaucrat. He was the divine middleman between gods and humans, so when he demanded tribute, it wasn't viewed as exploitation. It was seen as maintaining cosmic balance. Ma'at, the sacred order of the universe. Nothing like being taxed by a god to keep things in perspective. Money, as we know it, didn't really exist in early Egyptian society. So how did the pharaoh fill his royal coffers? Grain. Lots and lots of grain. The Nile's annual flooding ensured fertile fields, and after harvest, scribes would arrive, clipboard in hand, or rather, papyrus scroll, to measure exactly how much you owed. They used rope, sticks, and something resembling a calculator made of frustration. If your land produced 10 sacks, you might owe 3 to the state. Not paying, not an option. You could lose your land, your cattle, or find yourself mysteriously volunteered for a state labour project. Because yes, you could also pay in labour. The towering pyramids of Giza weren't built by aliens or slaves. They were built in part by taxpayers. If you didn't have enough grain or goods, you could be conscripted for public works, hauling limestone, digging irrigation canals, or constructing the latest shrine to Horus. Congratulations, you're now part of Egypt's National Infrastructure Initiative. The whole system was recorded meticulously by scribes, those sharp-eyed record keepers with a monopoly on literacy. They documented everything, from how much wheat you owed to whether your donkey was taxable. Yes, even animals could be taxed. If it moved and had value, chances are the state wanted a piece of it. Egypt's tax system was centralized, efficient, and, when needed, brutally enforced. But it was also flexible. During years of famine or poor flooding, tax collectors might reduce quotas, not out of kindness necessarily, but because dead farmers don't pay taxes. Leave it to the Romans to turn bodily functions into taxable assets. In the sprawling empire of marble forums and gladiator games, taxation was both a bureaucratic art and a source of legendary grumbling. You could be taxed for land, slaves, doors, and yes, urine, because nothing says efficient government like charging people to pee. Let's start with the infamous urine tax, or vectigal uriny. Public urinals and fullers' workshops collected human urine, which was then used, no joke, as a source of ammonia to bleach clothing and tan leather. So, when Emperor Vespasian realized this bodily byproduct was chemically useful, he did what any responsible emperor would do. He taxed the collectors. The phrase, "money doesn't stink," pecunia non olet, was born when his son Titus questioned the morality of such a tax. Vespasian handed him a coin and asked if it smelled. It didn't. Point made. But that's just the tip of the imperial iceberg. Rome had taxes on windows to encourage modest architecture. Slave ownership came with its own tariff, and inheritance taxes could shave off a chunk of what you left behind. There was even a sales tax, though it only applied to free citizens, because if you were enslaved, congratulations. You were already a form of taxable property. Tax collectors were called publicani, and let's just say they weren't winning popularity contests. These middlemen paid the state in advance for the right to collect taxes, then squeezed citizens for as much as possible to turn a profit. They were the ancient equivalent of a private collection agency run by a hedge fund. And if you refused to pay, soldiers might show up to help convince you. Despite all this, Roman taxation funded some impressive projects: aqueducts, roads, temples, and military conquests that stretched the empire from Britain to Syria. You could argue that Roman taxes built civilization and crushed it, depending on where you stood. And yes, tax revolts happened. Provinces groaned under the weight of tribute, and more than one rebellion started with the words, "How much?" In the heart of Mesoamerica, the Aztec Empire ran one of the most elaborate and structured tribute systems the world has ever seen. And no, it wasn't based on gold or coins. It was powered by cocoa beans, jaguar pelts, and feathers so fine they made European kings look underdressed. Unlike modern tax systems, Aztec taxation was known as tribute, and it operated like a giant imperial wish list. The emperor didn't need your permission. He needed your region's best products, delivered regularly, and preferably without excuses. Every city-state, or altopetal, that fell under Aztec control was required to send tribute, recorded meticulously by scribes known as calpixca. These men carried detailed codices illustrating what was owed, not numbers, but pictures, piles of maize, stacks of cotton, bundles of obsidian, and yes, sacks of cocoa beans. Think of it as a pictorial invoice from hell. Cocoa beans were especially valuable, not just as food or drink, but as currency. A handful could buy a tamale, a cloak, or a night out at the local human sacrifice. They were so prized that counterfeiters tried to hollow them out and refill them with dirt. Audacious, yes, but also a crime punishable by death. The IRS of Tenochtitlan did not mess around. Tribute items could range from the delicious, turkey's honey, to the decorative, jade gold dust, to the downright inconvenient, giant logs carried from forests miles away. One province had to deliver embroidered warrior costumes regularly, complete with battle-ready sandals. Another specialized in exotic bird feathers, which were woven into headdresses for nobles and gods alike. Imagine trying to explain to your village why your tax burden is 30 live parrots and 2 jaguar pelts. Sorry, kids, jaguar chasing day again. Failure to pay tribute could result in violent retribution. Aztec tax collectors weren't shy, and rebellious provinces were often met with military reminders. Compliance was a matter of survival, not civic duty. Despite the harsh terms, the tribute system kept the empire thriving. The capital, Tenochtitlan, was a city of floating gardens, gleaming temples, and markets bursting with goods, much of it paid for by the backs of tributary towns. In ancient China, taxation was less about flamboyant punishments or bizarre goods, and more about sheer scale. With a population in the tens of millions, and an empire that seemed to go on forever, China built a bureaucratic tax machine so vast and precise, it would make Roman senators weep into their wine. Let's start with the basics: rice and labor. During the Han Dynasty, peasants were the economic backbone, and they paid taxes in 3 primary forms: grain, cloth, and corvée labor. The grain filled the empire's granaries, the cloth was handed to state officials, and the labor? Well, that meant weeks or months away from home working on canals, roads, or the occasional Great Wall renovation. Think of it as tax season, but instead of paperwork, you're hauling bricks through the Gobi. As the empire evolved, so did its taxes. The Tang dynasty introduced the two-tax system, which was meant to simplify things. It required twice-yearly payments, once in summer, once in autumn, calculated according to how much land you owned and how many people you had lying around eating your rice. In theory, it was fair. In practice, tax collectors had a flexible understanding of fair. And then came the salt tax, the quiet empire builder. Rather than taxing everyone equally, the government slapped a heavy tax on salt, a daily necessity. Everyone needed it, especially in a time before refrigerators, and so the state made a fortune. For centuries, salt revenue funded armies, palaces, and bureaucrats' pensions. It's no exaggeration to say salt underwrote dynasties. But taxation wasn't just about funding. It was about control. Census-taking was practically an art form, as were land surveys and household registries. The goal? To know exactly how much rice you grew, how many sons you had, and whether you were hiding a second ox behind the barn. Of course, it wasn't all order and harmony. Excessive taxation was one of the top causes of peasant revolts, like the Yellow Turban Rebellion, which exploded in the late Han period. When farmers are starving and still being asked for 30% of their rice, bad things tend to happen. Long before modern accountants began asking for your W-2s, ancient Mesopotamians were already inventing the fine art of taxation. With clay tablets, reed styluses, and absolutely zero tolerance for creative deductions. In the land between the Tigris and Euphrates, the Sumerians, Babylonians, and Assyrians created the world's first tax system, and with it, history's first recorded complaints about taxes. Instead of paper forms, scribes etched tax records into soft clay. These cuneiform tablets, thousands of them, documented everything from barley contributions to livestock tallies. If you think your local tax office is slow, try waiting for your grain levy to be logged by a man scratching symbols into mud. The staple tax? Barley. In early city-states like Uruk and Lagash, farmers paid a portion of their harvest to the temple or palace. And the temples weren't just religious centres, they were full-blown economic hubs with tax officials, storerooms, and surprisingly stern priests. But grain wasn't all. Mesopotamians taxed fishermen on their catch, traders on their goods, and craftsmen on their workshops. Even donkeys weren't safe. If you had a working donkey or a cart, congratulations, you were now a small taxable transport business. Under the Babylonian king Hammurabi, taxation became even more structured. His famous legal code, one of the oldest in the world, laid out penalties for tax evasion, overcharging officials, and cheating the system. In some cases, the punishment wasn't just a fine, it was death or dismemberment. So if you ever feel like your modern tax form is harsh, remember, at least it doesn't come with a potential amputation. One unique feature of Mesopotamian taxation was its integration into public works. Citizens might pay taxes in bricks, silver, or labor, helping build canals, ziggurats, and city walls. If you couldn't pay in goods, the state could take your time, or your children's time. Nothing says fiscal responsibility like loaning your kid to the temple for a season. Yet, despite its age, the Mesopotamian tax system was remarkably efficient. It helped manage sprawling cities, fund irrigation networks, and support armies. In other words, it kept the whole operation from crumbling like a sun-baked mud brick. In ancient Greece, taxes were less about state order and more about awkwardly passing the bill around. Unlike centralized empires like Egypt or China, many Greek city-states, especially Athens, relied on a mix of civic pride, social pressure, and well-disguised tax avoidance strategies. Let's start with the basics. Direct taxation on citizens was rare. Athenian citizens didn't pay income tax like we do today. Instead, they were expected to contribute to the state through liturgies, a fancy way of saying, "Hey, rich guy, it's your turn to pay for a play, a worship, or a festival." These weren't technically taxes, but try saying no and still getting invited to dinner. Meanwhile, foreigners and metics, resident aliens who lived and worked in Athens, did pay taxes. They were required to fork over a monthly protection fee, which covered the privilege of not being a full citizen. Essentially, thanks for living here. Now cough it up. Trade was another gold mine. Import and export goods came through the bustling port of Piraeus, and Athens made sure to grab its cut with customs taxes, tolls, and docking fees. You could tax olive oil, wine, or pottery, just not ideas. Those flowed freely from the mouths of philosophers who, naturally, had opinions about taxation too. Plato believed that rulers should live modestly and serve the state, not profit from it. Aristotle, ever the realist, saw taxation as a necessary part of governance, though he noted that excessive taxation could lead to rebellion. Meanwhile, the average Athenian just wanted the tax collectors to stay far away from their grape harvest. Which brings us to the real villains of the story, tax farmers. Rather than collecting taxes themselves, Greek states auctioned off the right to collect them. The highest bidder would pay the state up front, then go out and recoup the money, plus plenty extra. These tax farmers were about as popular as wet tunics at a symposium. Despite the chaos, the system worked, more or less. Taxes funded temples, wars, roads, and democracy itself. But resentment simmered, especially among the poor, and tax abuse occasionally led to public outrage, lawsuits, or exile. Welcome to the Inca Empire, where you didn't pay taxes with money, or even cocoa beans. You paid with your hands, feet, and spine. The Inca created one of the most impressive civilizations in the Americas, stretching across modern-day Peru, Ecuador, Bolivia, and Chile. And they did it without coins, markets, or written language. So how did they fund it all? With a tax system based entirely on labour, known as the mitar. The mitar wasn't a suggestion, it was mandatory state service. Every able-bodied male citizen owed the empire a set number of days each year, usually spent building roads, farming state land, mining silver, or hauling stones for temples and fortresses. Picture the Inca tax form as a calendar, not a bill. The genius of the mitar system was its efficiency. Instead of centralizing everything in one place, the empire broke up labor across thousands of local communities called ailis. Each ailu sent its workers when called upon, and in return, the empire provided food, tools, and access to communal storehouses. You gave your time and got survival. Need a bridge over a mountain gorge? The mitar provided. Need hundreds of miles of paved roads to connect cities like Cusco and Machu Picchu? Mitar. Want a massive stone temple where each block weighs as much as a bus? Yes, that too. But the taxes didn't stop at muscle. Citizens were also expected to grow crops on state-owned fields, raise llamas for transport, and weave cloth for the military and aristocracy. Entire regions specialized in producing maize, potatoes, or textiles for redistribution. The empire stored these goods in enormous warehouses, kolkas, strategically placed along roads for use in times of famine or war. Unlike many other ancient civilizations, the Incas didn't use tax collectors in the traditional sense. Instead, local leaders kept quipus, knotted cords used to track labor and production. They didn't need writing when they had the world's most complex tax abacus made of string. And yes, resistance existed. After the Spanish arrived, they co-opted the mitar for forced mining labor, which quickly turned exploitative and deadly. What had once been a system of communal duty became a nightmare. During the Islamic Golden Age, from the 8th to 13th centuries, the empires of the Middle East, North Africa, and parts of Europe ran some of the most sophisticated taxation systems the world had seen since Rome. But unlike earlier models of raw extraction, Islamic taxation came wrapped in moral philosophy, religious duty, and meticulous bookkeeping. At the heart of it all was zakat, a religious tax and one of the 5 pillars of Islam. It wasn't just a donation, it was mandatory. Every able Muslim was expected to give around 2.5% of their wealth annually to help the poor, the indebted, and travellers in need. It was a tax designed not to fund palaces or armies, but to promote social justice. Think of it as the original wealth redistribution scheme, only with divine oversight. But zakat was just the beginning. There was also the kharaj, a land tax levied on non-Muslims who farmed conquered lands, and the jizya, a poll tax paid by non-Muslims in exchange for protection and exemption from military service. These taxes weren't arbitrary. They were legally defined, scaled according to wealth, and in many cases negotiated between communities and rulers. Non-Muslims could keep their religions and local customs as long as they paid on time. To manage all this, the caliphates developed a professional class of scribes and accountants. They kept ledgers in Arabic script, tracked markets, and issued receipts. The Diwan, or state treasury, was not a chaotic chest of coins, but a centralized bureaucracy with trained clerks and standardized forms. Think Excel sheets, but on parchment. One unique feature of Islamic taxation was its connection to market regulation. Officials known as muhtasibs roamed bazaars to ensure fair pricing, honest weights, and moral conduct. If you tried to hide your profits to avoid zakat, the muhtasib might appear with a scale, a stern stare, and possibly a citation from the Quran. And while corruption wasn't unknown, there were regular audits and public accountability. Some rulers, like Umar ibn al-Khattab, were known for walking the streets in disguise, checking that tax burdens weren't crushing the people. In many ways, taxation in the Islamic Golden Age balanced profit with piety. It built schools, hospitals, libraries, and fostered an intellectual explosion that influenced Europe for centuries. In medieval Europe, paying taxes was less about civic duty and more about surviving feudal extortion with most of your limbs intact. While kings and nobles claimed divine right, it was the peasants who felt the weight of every coin, chicken, and bale of hay that disappeared into the tax wagon. The most notorious medieval tax, the tithe. This wasn't a state-imposed levy, but a mandatory 10% of your income paid to the church. That meant a tenth of your crops, livestock, or fish went straight to the local monastery. Refused to pay? You weren't just dodging taxes, you were risking eternal damnation. It's hard to argue with a tax backed by the threat of hellfire. Then came the feudal dues. If you were a peasant, your life was basically a subscription service to your lord. You paid for the land you farmed, for the mill you used, for the oven where you baked your bread. Got married? That was a fee. Inherited your father's field? Another fee. Had a particularly good harvest? Expect a smiling tax collector at your door with his hand out and a list of creative new charges. In England, after the Norman conquest, taxation became even more organised and ominous. The Domesday Book, compiled under William the Conqueror, was a giant survey of who owned what, down to how many pigs you had hiding in the back garden. It was essentially a tax sniper's scope, and no one escaped its gaze. By the 13th century, kings discovered new ways to raise funds, especially for war. In France and England, monarchs began introducing direct taxes on income and property. But with centralized power came centralized resentment. Tax collectors were often hated more than enemy armies. And when the state pushed too far, revolt. The English Peasants' Revolt of 1381 exploded in response to a brutal poll tax, a flat fee per person, regardless of wealth. It was the medieval equivalent of charging a lord and a farmer the same amount and expecting no one to notice. Spoiler, they noticed. Taxation in medieval Europe was a tightrope walk, enough to fund castles, cathedrals, and crusades, but not so much that it led to pitchforks and fire. And so, from cocoa beans to urine, from rice to forced labour, ancient taxation wasn't just about economics. It was about power, control, and the fragile thread between rulers and the ruled. One coin, one grain, one revolt at a time. To the Vikings, death wasn't the end. It was simply the beginning of a new journey. Life was fleeting, unpredictable, and often brutal. But death, that was where the real adventure began. And depending on how you lived, or more importantly, how you died, you could find yourself in vastly different destinations beyond the grave. The most coveted afterlife was Valhalla, the golden hall of Odin, where slain warriors gathered to feast, fight, and prepare for Ragnarok, the end of all things. To reach Valhalla, though, you had to die in battle. Ideally, while doing something heroic and very bloody. If that wasn't on the menu, there was still Folkvangr, the realm of the goddess Freya, who got first pick of the fallen. It's believed that her hall was equally prestigious, just with fewer head injuries. But not all souls went to warrior paradise. Those who died from sickness, old age, or without enough flair were said to drift to hell, the shadowy realm ruled by the goddess of the same name. Contrary to modern interpretations, hell wasn't necessarily a punishment, just a more subdued afterlife, possibly with fewer drinking horns and battle songs. With such an elaborate spiritual map, it's no surprise that Viking funeral rites were carefully staged performances, part tribute, part guidance system for the soul, and part flex for the living. A well-executed funeral showed respect, wealth, and community status. A sloppy one? That was a recipe for haunting, bad luck, or worse, a dishonoured soul wandering without rest. These funerals weren't about closure. They were about ensuring safe passage to the next world and proving that the deceased mattered, both in life and in death. Even the humblest funeral might include offerings of food, weapons, and personal belongings to equip the departed for their journey. And for the elite? The Norse didn't do subtle. Chieftains, warriors, and nobles often received grand send-offs involving ships, flames, burial mounds, animal sacrifices, and entire ceremonies performed with chilling precision. The goal was not just to honour the dead, but to cement their legacy in the sagas and in memory. Because in Viking culture, to be remembered was to live on. The funeral wasn't the final chapter. It was the first page of the afterlife. In Viking society, the dead weren't just dumped in a pit and forgotten. They were prepared with care, intention, and a touch of theatrical flair. If death was a journey, then the deceased needed to be dressed like a traveller, and packed like one too. Once a person passed, their body was washed, combed, and dressed in their finest clothing. This wasn't about vanity, it was symbolic. Cleanliness showed respect, and fine garments helped ensure the deceased entered the next world with honour. A chieftain might be laid out in a rich woolen tunic, his cloak trimmed in fur. A shield maiden might wear embroidered dresses, adorned with brooches and beads. Jewellery wasn't just for show, it was spiritual luggage. Weapons were essential. A warrior might be buried with his sword, axe or spear, along with a shield. These weren't ceremonial props, they were actual tools for the afterlife. After all, if you were going to fight all day in Valhalla, you'd want your favourite blade by your side. Even common folk were sometimes buried with knives or simple tools, suggesting that utility mattered as much as status. The dead were also given grave goods: drinking horns, cooking pots, combs, dice, and sometimes food and mead. It's as if they were packing for a very long trip, with a few snacks and a bit of entertainment. These objects served practical, religious, and sentimental purposes. In some cases, they were deliberately broken before burial, a practice that may have released the object's spirit for use in the afterlife. Social rank played a big role. The wealthier or more important the person, the more elaborate the prep. There are records of servants or slaves being sacrificed to join their masters, though these were rare and usually reserved for high-ranking individuals. It was brutal, yes, but in Viking belief, it was an honour to accompany your lord into the next world. Once the body was prepared, it was laid out for a time, giving the community a chance to mourn, reflect, and say goodbye. This was also when the funerary rituals would begin in earnest. Prayers, chants, and even ritualized storytelling to cement the dead's legacy. To the Vikings, preparing the dead wasn't a grim task. It was an act of love, of respect, and of cosmic responsibility. They weren't just dressing a corpse, they were arming a soul for the journey beyond. When most people think of Viking funerals, they picture a flaming longship drifting into the horizon, sails ablaze, carrying a warrior to Valhalla. It's an image burned into pop culture, cinematic, dramatic, and just a little impractical. But how accurate was it? The short answer: partly true, partly poetic license. Vikings had a deep relationship with ships. These weren't just modes of transportation. They were symbols of power, status, and life itself. To be buried in a ship, or even with part of one, was the ultimate farewell. For seafarers, warriors, and nobles, it represented a return to the sea, to the gods, or to the great journey ahead. But contrary to popular belief, most Viking funeral ships were not set on fire and pushed out to sea. That image likely comes from a combination of later medieval myths and 19th century romantic paintings. In reality, full ship burials were rare and expensive. When they did happen, the ship was usually placed on land, the body and grave goods arranged inside, and the whole structure was either buried under a mound or set on fire in place. One of the most famous examples is the Oseberg burial, found in Norway. It contained a beautifully carved ship holding two women, richly dressed, surrounded by textiles, sledges, and animal sacrifices. No flames, just earth and legacy. Another example, the Gokstad burial, held the body of a chieftain, his weapons, tools, and even sacrificed horses. Again, no water, no fire, just honor and craftsmanship. That said, there were cremation burials involving boats, or symbolic representations of them. In some regions, smaller boats or boat-shaped outlines made of stones were used in cremation ceremonies, with the pyre built directly on the ship. These events were spectacular, if not logistically simple. Burning an entire boat took a lot of wood, space, and nerves of steel. The fire wasn't just for show. In Viking belief, fire purified the soul, sending smoke upward to the gods. It also prevented the dead from returning as restless spirits, a very real fear in Norse mythology. Viking funerals weren't just solemn affairs, they were investments in the afterlife. The dead weren't sent off empty-handed. Instead, they were loaded up with grave goods, a kind of spiritual starter pack, designed to ensure comfort, status, and survival in the next world. Let's start with the essentials. Almost every Viking burial, from simple farmer to powerful jarl, included tools, weapons, and personal belongings. A man might be buried with his sword, axe, or bow. A woman might have keys, brooches, weaving tools, or even cooking pots. These weren't symbolic trinkets. They were believed to be used by the soul after death, in whatever realm they were bound for. Whether Valhalla or Hell, no one wanted to show up unarmed or without proper home goods. Wealthier individuals received more elaborate send-offs. Some burials include drinking horns, board games, imported silks, musical instruments, and entire carts or sledges. One woman in the famous Oseberg burial was interred with an ornate wagon, 5 intricately carved animal heads, and dozens of textiles, enough to open a boutique in the afterlife. But what really set Viking funerals apart was their use of animal sacrifice. Horses were common companions in elite burials, symbols of status, transportation, and power. Archaeologists have uncovered graves with multiple horses, carefully arranged, clearly sacrificed for the occasion. Dogs, hawks, and even oxen also make appearances, each likely chosen for specific spiritual or symbolic reasons. In some cases, the sacrifices extended beyond animals. Slaves or servants might be killed and buried alongside their master. This wasn't casual cruelty. It was considered a form of loyalty or service, though from a modern perspective, it's undeniably grim. Some accounts, like that of Ahmad ibn Fadlan, describe shocking rituals where a slave girl was ritually killed to accompany a chieftain into the afterlife, believing she would continue to serve him in death. Everything placed in the grave, living or lifeless, had a purpose. The Vikings believed the soul needed support, just as it did in life. Grave goods were gifts, provisions, and protection, meant to carry status and functionality across the cosmic divide. In Viking culture, death didn't just take someone from the world, it left a mark on it. And that mark was often massive, unmistakable, and visible for miles. Enter the burial mound, or hauger in Old Norse, a carefully crafted hill raised over the dead to honour their life, their deeds, and let's be honest, their social standing. These weren't just piles of dirt. Viking burial mounds were deliberate monuments, built with labour and care, A chieftain's mound might be raised over a buried ship or wooden chamber, filled with grave goods and sealed with layers of stone and soil. Some were covered in turf to blend with the landscape, others left raw and stony, a permanent message to the living. Someone important lies here. The size of the mound mattered. Bigger mound, bigger legacy. These weren't just graves, they were status symbols, visible reminders of a family's power, wealth, and ancestry. In some cases, mounds were arranged in specific patterns, forming ship shapes or ritual alignments with celestial events. Yes, Vikings were practical, but they were also deeply symbolic. These mounds also served a communal role. They became sacred places, sites of remembrance and storytelling. Families might gather there for seasonal rituals, feasts, or oaths. The burial mound became a bridge between generations, between the living and the dead. And sometimes they weren't content to bury just one person. Mounds could contain multiple graves, added over time, turning a single burial into a dynastic monument. In this way, land wasn't just occupied by the living, it was claimed by the dead, shaping identity and memory for centuries. Not all Viking burials were so grand. Common folk might receive flat graves or simple stone circles, especially in regions where soil and space made mound building impractical. But even these had care: grave goods, cremation remains, and orientation with the sun or stars. It was a reminder that even in modest death, the Viking spirit sought meaning. To burn or to bury? That was the Viking funeral dilemma, and the answer depended on region, status, era, and belief. While modern Viking imagery tends to lean heavily toward dramatic flames and firelit farewells, the truth is more nuanced. Vikings used both cremation and inhumation, often side by side in the same communities. Let's start with cremation. In early Viking periods, especially in Sweden and parts of Denmark, cremation was the dominant rite. The body would be placed on a funeral pyre, surrounded by grave goods, and set ablaze. The fire was not just destruction, it was purification, a spiritual release. The rising smoke carried the soul upward, perhaps to Odin, perhaps to another realm entirely. After the flames died down, the ashes and charred bones were carefully collected, and either buried in an urn or scattered in a stone-lined grave. But cremation wasn't just about reaching the gods, it also served practical purposes. In societies where space was limited, or where wild animals posed a threat to shallow graves, fire made sense. And let's not ignore the psychological side. Cremation ensured the dead didn't return. Norse myths are full of restless spirits, undead warriors, and revenants. Reducing a body to ash made haunting less likely. As time passed, especially by the late Viking Age, inhumation, the burial of intact bodies, became more common, particularly under the growing influence of Christianity. Inhumation was more in line with Christian ideas of resurrection and bodily preservation. But even before Christianity, some Viking communities favoured burial in chambers, ships, or wooden coffins, with the body laid out in full dress, surrounded by goods, animals, and tools. Interestingly, both methods often coexisted. A chieftain might be cremated on a pyre, while his wife was buried nearby. Or cremation might be used for warriors, while inhumation suited farmers and traders. The choice could reflect personal identity, social class, or regional custom. What united both rites was the attention to detail and honour. Whether turned to smoke or sealed beneath a mound, the Viking dead were treated with reverence, as travellers heading into the next world, however they chose to get there. Viking funerals weren't quiet affairs. They were ritualistic send-offs, full of song, storytelling, toasts, and symbolic acts. While the physical treatment of the body, burning, burying, loading into ships, was essential, the rituals of the living were just as important. To die well was one thing, but to be remembered properly, that was immortality. At the heart of many Viking funerals were songs and poetry. Skalds, or poets, played a crucial role in preserving the memory of the deceased. They composed elegies and funeral verses, recounting the person's deeds, their lineage, their victories, and even their personality quirks. These verses weren't just mournful, they were epic, casting the dead in the mould of saga heroes. If you weren't sung about at your own funeral, did you even die a Viking? Funerals also involved ritual toasting, known as the minnie. Drinking horns were passed, mead flowed, and each toast honoured not just the departed, but the gods, ancestors, and fate itself. These were solemn moments, but also deeply social, blending mourning with camaraderie. It was grief expressed with firelight and fermented honey. Offerings were made at the gravesite, sometimes food, sometimes weapons, sometimes blood. Sacrifices, especially of animals, could accompany the funeral, intended to guide or sustain the soul in the afterlife. These rituals were often led by a gothi, priest, or vulva, seeress, who conducted ceremonies with chants, symbolic gestures, and possibly a few unprintable incantations. In wealthier funerals, ritualized performances took place. Ibn Fadlan, the 10th century Arab diplomat, famously described the funeral of a Rus chieftain, likely Norseman settled along the Volga, which involved days of preparation, animal sacrifices, and the ritual killing of a slave girl who volunteered to accompany her master. Though horrifying by modern standards, it reveals the theatrical and religious weight the Vikings gave to death rites. Finally, memorial feasts could be held weeks later. These served to settle affairs, redistribute possessions, and honour the legacy. New leaders might be named, oaths sworn, stories told again. For the Vikings, death wasn't just a loss. It was a story to be told, a song to be sung, and a life to be celebrated with fire, voice, and drink. While fire consumed the body and song carried the soul, stone preserved the name. In Viking society, memory wasn't left to chance. It was carved, letter by letter, into the very bones of the earth. And thus came the rise of the rune stone, one of the most enduring Viking traditions of all. Rune stones weren't gravestones in the modern sense. You weren't placing a small marker next to a plot. You were erecting a public monument, meant to be seen, read, and respected. These stones stood along roads, near bridges, at crossroads, and beside burial mounds, bold declarations of the life and legacy of the dead. The inscriptions were written in runic script, an alphabet used across the Norse world. Some were simple. Gunnar raised this stone in memory of his brother. Others were sprawling epics, recounting voyages, battles, and deeds. Some even included curses for anyone who dared deface or move the stone. If you move this stone, may your bones rot, and your cattle give no milk. Vikings didn't mess around. And while many stones honoured warriors and chieftains, others memorialised merchants, travellers, and even women. A famous example is the Jelling stones in Denmark, massive rune stones erected by King Harald Bluetooth to honour his parents and declare the Christianisation of Denmark. They blend pagan tradition with emerging Christian influence, showing how rune stones adapted over time. The act of carving a rune stone wasn't cheap. It required a skilled rune master, time, and a hefty piece of stone, usually granite or sandstone. But the reward was eternity. To raise a rune stone was to say, "This life mattered. This person will not be forgotten." Even centuries later, their words still speak across time. Some rune stones included images, ships, weapons, animals, or symbols of power. Others were more abstract, twisting runes into serpent shapes or dragon curves. The artistry was as much a statement as the message itself. In a world of oral tradition, where most stories were passed by voice, the runestone was a physical anchor, an unignorable reminder carved into the world itself. For all their strength and stoicism, the Vikings had one lingering fear that fire, stone, or sword couldn't easily solve: the dead who wouldn't stay dead. Because in Norse belief, not all spirits departed peacefully. Some lingered, some returned, and some refused to leave at all. These were the Draga, restless dead, who rose from their graves with bloated bodies, glowing eyes, and a very bad attitude. They weren't airy ghosts. They were corporeal, dangerous, and spiteful, known to crush bones, break doors, and sometimes sit on sleeping people like a sweaty boulder of vengeance. The Viking version of a horror movie, except you might actually know the guy from your village. What caused a person to become a Draugr? Usually a bad death or a bad life. Greedy, violent, or dishonourable people were prime candidates. So were those who had unfinished business, jealousy, revenge, a sword debt, or just a deep hatred for their relatives. A poorly executed funeral could also result in an unhappy spirit. If the burial rites weren't performed properly, or if the grave goods were stolen, the dead might decide to check back in. To prevent this, Viking funerals included protective rituals. Sometimes the body was buried with heavy stones placed on top, to literally pin it down. Other graves show signs of being pierced with spears or stakes, a just-in-case strategy that would make any modern vampire hunter proud. In cremations, the body was burned thoroughly, not just for purification, but to destroy the form the Draugr could return in. But not all lingering dead were evil. Some were ancestral spirits, offering guidance or watching over family lands. These spirits, called Fylgjur or Disir, could be protective if treated respectfully. They were often honoured with seasonal offerings and quiet prayers at burial sites. Even the afterlife wasn't free from tension. A warrior's soul might spend eternity fighting in Valhalla, which sounds glorious until you realise it's a forever war with no weekends. The Vikings embraced the idea of struggle, even after death. Ultimately, death was never just an ending. It was a beginning, a warning, a haunting, and a story. The dead were never fully gone. They lingered in smoke, in song, in stone, and sometimes in footsteps you didn't expect to hear behind you.